I guess I have a talent for finding interesting items, and the frame of patches for this video really qualifies as interesting. This frame contains 8 patches of a mix of NASA Apollo missions, the programs that took us to the moon. These came from a local garage sale for $5 and nicely framed. The gentleman I purchased them from assembled the collection himself from various visits to Cape Kennedy. The earliest is from Apollo 7, which launched on October 11, 1968, and the latest was Apollo 17, which launched on December 7, 1972. What I'd like to do is take a brief look at each patch and the mission it represents. So we will begin with Apollo 7. This was the first Apollo mission to carry a crew into space. It was also the first mission since Gemini 7 in November 1966 to carry astronauts into space. The AS-204 mission, known as Apollo 1, was intended to be the first manned flight of the Apollo program and was scheduled to launch in February 1967, but tragically, a fire in the cabin during a January 1967 test killed the crew. As a result, manned flights were suspended for 21 months. I remember that event quite well. New safety procedures, though, were instituted, and Apollo 7 fulfilled Apollo 1's mission. The Apollo 7 crew was commanded by Walter M. Schirra, and the command module pilot was Don F. Esley, and the lunar module pilot was R. Walter Cunningham. The mission was all-day Earth orbital test flight to check out updated designs. This was the first time a Saturn IB vehicle put a crew into space, and this was also the first 3-person American space mission, and the first to include a live TV broadcast from an American space mission. With success of this mission, NASA had the confidence to go on to Apollo 8, which would go around the moon 2 months later. This was the last mission for this crew and also the last manned launch from Cape Kennedy. 2 months later, we have Apollo 8, and the patch well illustrates the mission, which was to orbit the moon and return. This was the second manned flight of the Apollo space program. The Apollo 8 craft launched on December 21, 1968. The 3-astronaut crew was made up of Commander Frank Borman, Command Major Pilot James Lovell, and the lunar module pilot William Anders. The crew became the first humans to travel beyond low Earth orbit and the first to see Earth as a whole planet. They were also the first to see the far, dark side of the moon and the first to witness an Earthrise. This was the third flight of the Saturn V rocket and that rocket's first manned launch. This was also the first human spaceflight to launch from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida and located adjacent to Cape Canaveral Air Force Station. Apollo 8 took 3 days to travel to the moon. It orbited 10 times over the course of 20 hours, during which the crew made a special Christmas Eve television broadcast in which they read the first 10 verses from Genesis. This was still a time when the United States was not ashamed of God and for the most part trusted in Him, a lesson we should well learn for today. But at that time, the broadcast was the most watched TV program ever. The success of Apollo 8 paved the way for Apollo 11, which would fulfill U.S. President John F. Kennedy's goal of landing a man on the moon before the decade of the 1960s ended. This patch is from Apollo 10 mission, which took flight on May 18, 1969, and it was the 4th manned mission and the second to orbit the moon. The mission was a dress rehearsal for the first moon landing, testing all of the components and procedures just shy of actually making a landing. The lunar module came to within 8.4 nautical miles of the lunar surface, which is the point where powered descent to the lunar surface would begin. Its success enabled the first landing to be attempted on Apollo 11 in July of 1969. This mission also set a world record. This was for the highest speed attained by a manned vehicle at a phenomenal 24,791 miles per hour during their return trip from the moon. And due to the use of their names as call signs, Peanuts comic strip characters Charlie Brown and Snoopy became semi-official mascots for the mission. Actually, Peanuts creator Charles Schulz also drew some special mission-related artwork. I was but a kid, yet when this mission flew, and I remember having all sorts of tie-in items, including a 10-inch tall Snoopy figure dressed in an astronaut's uniform. I wish I still had him. He was pretty cool. Here we'll jump ahead to the Apollo 12, as I don't have a patch for the Apollo 11. Apollo 12 was the 6th manned flight. in the Apollo program and the second to land on the moon. This mission launched on November 14, 1969 from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, and just 4 months after Apollo 11, which was the first moon landing. The mission commander was Charles Pete Conrad, and the lunar module pilot was Alan L. Bean. Performed just over 1 day and 7 hours of lunar surface activity, while command module pilot Richard F. Gordon remained in lunar orbit. The landing site for the mission was located in the southeastern portion of the Ocean of Storms. Unlike the first landing on Apollo 11, Conrad and Bean achieved a precise landing at their expected location, the site of the Surveyor 3 unmanned probe, which had landed on April 20, 1967. They carried the very first color television camera to the lunar surface on an Apollo flight, but transmission was lost after Bean accidentally destroyed the camera by pointing it at the sun. On one of the 2 moonwalks, they visited the Surveyor and removed some parts for return to Earth. The mission ended on November 24th with a successful splashdown. Apollo 13 was the 7th manned mission in the program and the 3rd intended to land on the moon. The craft was launched on April 11, 1970, but the lunar landing was aborted after an oxygen tank exploded 2 days later, crippling the service module upon which the command module depended. Despite great hardship caused by limited power, loss of cabin heat, shortage of potable water, and a critical need to make makeshift repairs to the carbon dioxide removal system, the crew safely returned to Earth on April 17th. I remember that so well. It seemed like the entire nation held their breath and prayed nonstop for those brave men in space. The flight passed the far side of the moon at an altitude of 137 nautical miles above the lunar surface and 248,655 miles from Earth, a spaceflight record, making the furthest humans ever traveled from the Earth. The mission was commanded by James A. Lovell, with John L. Jack Swigert as command module pilot and Fred W. Hayes as the lunar module pilot. Swigert was later replacement for Ken Mattingly, who was grounded by the flight surgeon as he had been exposed to the German measles. Apollo 14, which launched on January 31, 1971, was the 8th manned Apollo mission and the 3rd to land on the moon. The mission commander was Alan Shepard, command module pilot Stuart Roosa, and lunar module pilot Edgar Mitchell. Shepard and Mitchell made their lunar landing on February 5th in the Fra Mauro formation, originally the target of the aborted Apollo 13 mission. And during the 2 lunar EVAs, 94 plus pounds of moon rocks were collected and a number of scientific experiments were conducted. Shepard hit 2 golf balls on the lunar surface with a makeshift club that he had brought from Earth. Shepard and Mitchell spent 33.5 hours on the moon with almost 9 hours of EVA. While Shepard and Mitchell were on the surface, Roosa remained in lunar orbit aboard the command service module Kitty Hawk, doing scientific experiments and photographing the moon, including the landing site of the future Apollo 16. He took several hundred seeds on the mission, many of which were germinated on their return, resulting in the so-called moon trees. The trio ended their mission with a touchdown in the Pacific Ocean on February of 1971. Moving along to Apollo 15, this was the 9th manned Apollo mission and the 4th to land on the moon. It was the first of what was called J missions, which signified longer stays on the moon. This was also the first mission on which a lunar rover was used, beginning on July 26, 1971, and ended on August 7th. At the time, NASA considered this to have been the most successful manned flight ever achieved. Commander David Scott and lunar module pilot James Irwin spent 3 days on the moon, including 18.5 hours outside of the spacecraft. The mission landed near Hadley Reel in an area of the Mare Lumbrium called the Marsh of Decay. The crew explored the area using the first lunar rover, which allowed them to travel further from the lunar module than possible on other missions which did not have a rover. They collected 170 pounds of lunar surface material. Now, at the same time, command module pilot Alfred Worden conducted science experiments and doing photographing of the lunar surface. The mission was successful in accomplishing all of its objectives, but was marred by negative publicity that accompanied disclosure of the crew carrying unauthorized postage stamps which they had planned to sell after their return. Ironically, this mission was one of very few that had been honored with the issue of a commemorative U.S. stamp, with the first use of a lunar rover taking place 1 decade after the first launch of a Mercury astronaut. Then, the last patch I have is from Apollo 17, which was the last Apollo mission. It launched on December 7, 1972. The crew of this final Apollo mission consisted of Eugene Cernan, Ronald Evans, and Harrison Schmitt. This was the last use of Apollo hardware for its original purpose. After Apollo 17, extra Apollo spacecraft were used in the Skylab and the Apollo-Soyuz programs. This was also the final manned launch of Saturn V rocket. The mission included a 3-day expedition on the lunar surface with extended scientific capacity and a third lunar roving vehicle. Evans remained in lunar orbit. Cernan and Schmitt spent just over 3 days on the moon in the Taurus-Lithrow Valley and completed 3 moonwalks, taking lunar samples and deploying scientific instruments. The landing site was chosen with the primary objective of Apollo 17 in mind, to sample the lunar hyaline material, which was believed to be older than the impact material that formed Mare Imbrium, and investigate the possibility of relatively new volcanic activity in the same area. The mission ended with a successful splashdown on December 19th after a 12-day mission. This completes our look back at the Apollo space program. These were glory days in America of such an amazing degree that we've never reached again, and unfortunately and pessimistically probably never will. Please like and subscribe, and thanks for stopping by. God bless, and have a great evening.